Tonight, we won't march beneath banners or recite prayers that echo across stone walls. Instead, we'll stand in a small winter town where the bells drift farther than the people who hear them. The air smells of iron, parchment, and promises. Inside the church, candles lean toward the breath of a preacher telling his flock that there is a road to heaven one you can walk with dust on your boots and forgiveness in your pack. Out there, the snow is thin, the stars are sharper than they should be, and somewhere beyond the fields lies a city no one here has ever seen. They are told it glows. They are told it waits. They are told that sin can be measured in miles and salvation in blisters, so lower the lights. Let the sound of the wind settle over you like a pilgrim's cloak. And if your breathing begins to match the slow rhythm of hooves fading eastward into the cold, don't resist it. That is just the night carrying you along the same road they once believed would lead them home. If quiet journeys like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next vow will remember you there. And somewhere in that stillness, a parchment sighs open. You can almost hear the ink breathing thin lines curling into sentences that promise forgiveness at walking speed. The bells outside are distant now, muffled by snow, but their echo clings to the air like an unfinished thought. Imagine the room, rough benches, frost on the windows, a priest's hand trembling slightly as he folds the letter that will send a village toward Jerusalem. No maps, no certainty, only the idea that one step could erase a lifetime. The quills rest, the wax seals harden, and for a moment, faith looks like paperwork done carefully by candlelight. That is where the road begins, with ink, with promises, and with the quiet belief that distance itself can wash the soul clean. The promise as sold was remarkably efficient. You lived your ordinary, uneven life accumulating a mixture of guilt, worry, and unpaid tithes, and then instead of dealing with any of it in small, awkward conversations, you were offered one single dramatic errand. Sew a cross on your cloak, go east, and upon arrival the divine account would be miraculously balanced. It sounded like a limited time indulgence bundled with a walking holiday. The language was administrative in a comforting way. One journey, one vow, one destination. People standing at the back of crowded churches heard something even simpler than the preachers meant to say. Go on this road, and everything heavy inside your head becomes lighter. For a peasant who rarely left a 20-kilometer circle of fields, the idea of walking far away under official protection with sins handled by central management had a certain sleepy glow. It is easier to step into uncertainty when you are told the paperwork is already processed. Wrapped around this clean spiritual offer, rumors carried extra features. There were hints about land, about the kinds of fields where nobody's grandfather had already divided everything into thin, disappointing strips. Younger sons heard that in the East there were estates where nobody had yet told them they were surplus to requirements. Merchants heard about new roads. Knights heard about plunder spoken of in oddly hygienic terms, like clutter to be removed from infidel cities for the good of everyone involved. It was less an official brochure, more a traveling cloud of hopeful footnotes. You could imagine while half asleep by the hearth, wide valleys and warm stone houses and markets with better spices than the one sad bundle in your local stall. Letters and charters made it sound authorized. Taking the cross did not feel like running away. It felt like signing a contract with both heaven and history. For once, ambition and piety appeared to point in the same direction, which is rare enough to be suspicious, but nobody advertised that part. Under this glow, village after village watched men mark their cloaks and plan departure as if packing for a long, badly documented festival. They sold small plots, arranged guardians for families, and repeated to each other the headline, "One journey, many solutions." The detail that this road crossed unfamiliar mountains, shifting alliances, and supply chains managed by people who had never organized catering for tens of thousands was mentioned in softer tones. It is always the vague sentence about difficulties along the way that should keep you up at night, but in these sermons it simply floated past like incense, barely noticed as people mentally stacked absolution, adventure, and opportunity into the same wooden chest. Then the walking began, and it turned out the road was not designed with user experience in mind. Before anyone reached the enemies they had heard so much about, they encountered the more familiar opponent of every large historical project: logistics. Barns along the route were not magically fuller because distant preachers had made large promises. Some groups discovered that when several thousand extra guests arrive without confirmed reservations, the local grain supply develops a sudden nervous stutter. Provisions ran short, credit ran thin, and the clean spiritual language from home had to share space with very practical negotiations about bread, beer, and where exactly thousands of people planned to sleep without annoying everyone. A few bands solved this by turning on nearby communities who were easier to reach than any distant infidel, which says a lot about how selectively people apply their grand ideals when hungry. The journey slowed. What had sounded like a straight arrow east loosened into halts, arguments, and collections of carts clustered at town gates, waiting for permission or prices to drop. Instead of one united river of purpose, you had many streams, each with its own leaders, rumors, and optimistic maps. The sermons had suggested a holy highway. The ground delivered more of a muddy seasonal track, shared with traders, mules, and people politely wondering why so many heavily armed pilgrims had shown up without a clear catering plan. And meeting tents and smoky halls, princes and lords discussed who actually commanded whom, who owed loyalty to which emperor, and which road was both spiritually pleasing and less likely to run out of barley. Every delay shaved a little shine off the original promise. Still, the language of vow and absolution kept people moving. You cannot easily admit, after so many public declarations, that you may simply have joined a very long, badly organized group walk. Further along, messages overlapped like poorly stacked parchment. The Pope's words, Prince's ambitions, Byzantine caution, and camp rumors formed a quiet tangle. Some Crusaders imagined themselves as precise instruments of heaven. Others behaved like tourists with swords. A few tried to be accountants of their own salvation, adding up hardships as if suffering could be itemized. Orders arrived late or contradicted previous instructions. This was not unusual by medieval standards. It is difficult enough to coordinate a family trip when only one person has the actual address. Coordinating tens of thousands across mountains with no shared spreadsheet was bound to create mixed results. Around campfires, people repeated the original promises in shorter versions, sanded of complexity, as if reminding themselves that the road still knew where it was going. All this time, Jerusalem lived in their minds in a very particular way. Many had heard about it more than once every week, a city of stone, in song, holy and exact, waiting calmly for rightful visitors who would arrive like answers to a long-posed question. In imagination, simply approaching its walls would feel like walking into the last chapter of a book where everything is explained. Some pictured touching the stones and feeling a confirmation run through them, like a seal pressed into warm wax. Others quietly expected a visible sign that the great bargain was working, a sense of inner quiet, a lifted weight, an unambiguous forgiven, written not with ink, but with relief. In the soft space between sermon and sleep, Jerusalem was less a place and more a guarantee. When they finally reached the city after so much dust and disorder, nothing in its physical layout felt obliged to match the brochure. What happened around and within those walls included fear, confusion, harsh choices, and scenes we do not need to describe in detail if you are listening in the dark trying to relax. Chroniclers later celebrated victories in phrases that left careful gaps, a polite silence over moments that did not align with the pure, simple story people had been told at home. Absolution, when it came, did not arrive as a gentle page torn from heaven and handed to each participant. It was inferred, hoped for, sometimes asserted with slightly too much confidence. Some must have stood in streets that smelled of dust and smoke and tried to fit what they saw into the elegant equation they had been promised. One dangerous journey plus pledged loyalty equals sin removed. The arithmetic, in practice, looked a little less tidy. Life, of course, did not stop at the city gates or the initial wave of reports. The aftermath settled in with a slow, administrative weight. Instead of a clean ending, there were new states to run, towers to man, tax questions to answer, and neighbors to negotiate with who had not read the same speeches. The people who stayed became landlords, officials, mediators, or simply residents of places that required ordinary maintenance. The people who went home carried stories adjusted for their audiences, some brighter, some darker, most carefully edited. The initial image of a single heroic road closing neatly behind them became, over the years, a network of ongoing obligations. Castles needed repairs, treaties needed rewrites. Pilgrimage had turned, almost imperceptibly, into administration. From a long distance, when we look back without urgency, the First Crusade resembles two parallel scripts shelved side by side. On one, written in Sermon ink, a shining path stretches from confession to Jerusalem to certainty. On the other, written in travel stains, are notes about empty barns, delayed supplies, hard bargaining, unexpected detours, very human arguments. In a city that did not reorganize itself to match imported expectations, the gap between promise and experience did not break the story. It simply seeped into it. Later generations would quote whichever version suited the moment, sometimes both, without always noticing the join. So as you lie there, perhaps barely following the trail of these distant vows and slow-footed realities, you can imagine those two ledgers resting together in a quiet archive, ink faded, pages no longer arguing, the noise drained out of them until all that remains is a faint record of what people hoped for, what they met instead, and how even the largest proclamations eventually become something gentle enough to fall asleep beside. You might not expect an entire continent's sense of holiness to depend on sleepy men arguing quietly with the sunrise, but for a long time, that was more or less the situation. In the centuries before alarm clocks and synchronized phone screens, monasteries scattered across Europe tried to make sure the right prayers were mumbled at the right hours. Even though the hours themselves were not particularly cooperative, the day did not come neatly pre-sliced into equal units. It stretched and shrank with the seasons like an indecisive rubber band. Yet the bells were supposed to ring at precise moments, and someone had to decide when exactly terse stopped being prime, and whether it was really lauds, yet if the sky still looked offended. If you are still awake when we finally arrive at the problem of 13th century shadow links, you are more than welcome to subscribe for more of this gently malfunctioning chronology, though of course you should not strain yourself. Missing the button would be impressively on theme. In theory, it was simple. The rules said there were appointed times, matins deep in the night, lauds near dawn, prime in the early light, then terce sext, none as the sun moved, vespers toward evening, and compline before bed. In practice, that meant that somewhere inside thick stone walls, someone had to remain just awake enough to notice what the sky was doing, and then translate that into a bell. Many communities had a designated timekeeper, a man whose primary qualification was a reputation for waking up with fewer complaints than average. He would watch the narrow slit of the eastern horizon from a small window, or check the line of light on a wall, or, on cloudy mornings, desk politely. Manuals advised such men to observe the whitening of the sky, or the clear manifestation of dawn, phrases which make sense until you are the one standing there at an ambiguous shade of gray-blue, wondering whether a premature bell would technically annoy God. It was a calm kind of anxiety, the sort that pairs well with low lighting and long corridors. Overly specific solutions emerged. One monastery used a marked pillar in the cloister. When the shadow of a particular capital reached a certain tile, someone would ring. Another hung a cord from a window so that its tip brushed the floor at an angle only at a given hour, turning sunlight into a vaguely cooperative measuring tape. In northern winters, when the sun rose late and sulked at a low angle, these devices hesitated. Timekeepers wrapped in cloaks stood there watching a stubbornly sleepy sky, mentally pushing it upward. Their job description, written plainly, was to keep the hours. Their lived experience was to admit quietly, several times a week, that the universe did not seem to own a reliable clock. Still, the bells rang, a little earlier here, a little later there, and within each set of walls, everyone agreed to pretend this was exact enough. For nights, they required different tools, because shadows and white skies are unhelpfully absent. Water clocks came first in many places. Clay or metal vessels that let water drip at a steady pace from one pot to another. Marks on the inside or outside told you how much time had passed. This looked impressively scientific, as long as you did not think too hard about temperature, mineral deposits, irregular holes, or the cheerful habit of medieval buildings to host small insects with unknown opinions about hydraulics. A monk set to watch the clepsydra at night might lean close in the wavering candlelight and try to decide whether the trickle seemed fast for this hour, which is not a formal unit of measurement. Candle clocks offered an alternative. Long candles with lines scratched along their length, each line allegedly marking a fixed span of time as the wax melted. These worked best in a world without drafts, devout moths, or human forgetfulness, which is to say they worked beautifully in theory and charmingly in no actual room. Yet the community adapted, smoothing over these small inaccuracies with habit. If matins began when the water in the upper bowl looked suitably low, then that was, by definition, when matins began. The point was not numerical precision, but rhythm, the sense that the prayers and psalms followed a dependable pattern, like beats on a string or tiles in a corridor. Manuals describe procedures in serious tones: how often to refill the water, where to place the candle, how to appoint a brother of proven vigilance to mind them. Between the lines you can almost hear the unspoken knowledge that sometimes the vigilant brother nodded off, the water stopped, the candle guttered, and matins began with a small, collective shrug 2 intervals late. In the grand ledger of eternity, a delayed recitation of Psalm 95 probably did not cause an audit. The deeper difficulty was that the length of the hours themselves did not stay put. In many early systems, daylight was divided into 12 equal parts between sunrise and sunset, and night was divided likewise. This meant that in summer, an hour might drift generously past what we would now call 75 minutes, while in winter it squeezed down below 50. The monks knew this in principle, but living inside it is another matter. The 6th-hour sects could feel leisurely in June with plenty of time for chanting and a thoughtful stroll along the cloister, and comically compressed in December when the sun seemed to rise only to remember something elsewhere and vanish. Imagine setting your daily schedule to a clock whose numbers slide up and down the face depending on the month, and doing it all with nothing but water pots and the color of the sky. Some houses constructed elaborate sundials that tried to compensate for these seasonal shifts, with curves and lines traced carefully on stone. They identified not just the hours, but different versions of them for different times of year, turning the cloister wall into a quiet mathematical puzzle. A monk could stand and align the shadow with one among many intersecting marks, arriving at terce, as appropriate for late April. For a viewer centuries later, these carvings seemed densely symbolic. For the man responsible for lunch, They simply said when to start the soup. The beauty of it is in the seriousness with which it was all treated. Entire lives revolved around slicing the day according to a system that, under close inspection, behaved like a polite but unreliable pet. Affectionate, bounded, and occasionally determined to do something else. As engineering crept forward, more complex water clocks appeared, decorated with little figures that tipped or chimed as levels shifted. Some designs promised to strike bells at set intervals without human assistance. In practice, they provided something closer to entertainment. A mechanism clogged by sediment might ring matins half an hour early, with the enthusiasm of a child let loose on a kitchen pan, or fail to ring it all until an irritated brother tapped it, at which point it emptied itself in a rush, suggesting that all remaining canonical hours should commence immediately. Repairs called for skills not universally found in men trained to copy manuscripts. Diaries hint at outside craftsmen occasionally summoned to coax these devices back into something like obedience. The timekeepers remained, now half human, half supervisor to an aquatic intern. Eventually, the first mechanical clocks appeared on towers and in monastic precincts, with gears, escapements, and heavy stones persuading each other to move at a reasonably regular pace. They did not have faces at first, they only rang. For communities used to watching the sky, this was a curious inversion. Now the bells told you how the heavens ought to be behaving. When the clock said it was time for vespers, the sun might disagree by a noticeable margin, especially when the clock had been left unregulated for some weeks. Adjustments were done by trial and error. The man with the key to the mechanism would climb up, listen to the tick, and decide whether it felt slow, then lift, lower, or nudge something important. For a while, the monastery lived with two truths, the old solar sense of the hours and the new metallic opinion. If they conflicted, the community often compromised by accepting whichever seemed less disruptive to the schedule of meals. What is gentle about this slow evolution is how little drama it actually produced. No councils met to declare one particular sundial line heretical. No wars were launched over a misjudged nun. It was a long, patient attempt to live in step with both a rulebook and a sky that refused to adopt clear increments. The monks woke, chanted, worked, and slept according to signals produced by candles, shadows, dripping water, cautious guesses, and later machines. The vast machinery of devotion ran on slightly wobbly cogs, and everyone carried on as if this were both expected and acceptable. In a sense, it was. The purpose of the hours was to mark the day with reminders, not to polish seconds. If you picture it now, with your own display glowing a precise, numerically smug time beside you, there's a small softness in thinking of that older, blurrier schedule. Somewhere around what we would call 2:17 in the morning, a monk stirred because the water level in a jar looked low enough to mean matins. He rang a bell, others shuffled from their pallets, words rose and fell, and outside the sky continued its slow gradient toward dawn without checking anyone's calculations. Some nights the bell was early, some late, some almost perfectly placed by accident. Over centuries, all of those tiny misalignments have dissolved into one impression, a steady pattern of voices and bells wrapped around days and seasons. It is pleasantly uneventful, this history of people trying to keep time with things that did not want to be tamed. And if your eyelids are heavier now than when we began, you are already in tune with them, drifting on a schedule that no longer needs to be exactly measured by any clock at all. You might not expect the quiet life of medieval bridge maintenance accounts to tell you much about Europe, but if you look closely at the ledgers, you get an extremely detailed story about people worrying, very politely, about planks. Not about wars, not about kings exactly, but about whether a certain beam near the western pier had been repaired with the proper number of iron nails, and if Brother Henry had indeed returned the hammer. If you are somehow still awake by the time we reach the section on standardized pebble sizes used to test loose boards, You are welcome to subscribe for more of this. But of course, do not feel obliged. Falling asleep in the middle of a 14th century bridge audit is probably the most authentic way to engage with it. On paper, a bridge was a single object, a line on a map over a river, a simple piece of infrastructure. In practice, it was a slow wooden argument with water, frost carts, and human habits. Towns that had a bridge kept notebooks about it that read like very calm diaries. They listed every plank, every support, each fastening inspected after storms. They specified which citizen owed how many days of labor shoveling silt or replacing railings, and which local widow had permission to sell apples at the northern end on market days, as long as her stall did not impede the traffic of pack animals. There were entries about renting out tiny chapel spaces built into bridge towers, about a box for alms nailed beside a particularly picturesque arch, and about a man fined for tying his goat to a load-bearing beam. Government, in that world, often meant somebody's neat handwriting explaining why goats should not lean on structural elements. Medieval bridges, especially the crowded ones in growing towns, behaved less like engineering projects and more like very slow streets that forgot they were suspended in midair. Shops crept onto them, houses perched on their sides. One document patiently records discussions about whether a barber's wastewater could be tipped directly into the river from his window, or whether this would anger both the fish and the bishop. Another goes into exquisite detail about the dimensions of stalls, leaving just enough space for 2 carts to pass if both drivers were sensible and neither mule was having a dramatic day. The bridge wardens in actual role in several towns spent their time collecting small tolls, hiring carpenters, and sending mild letters to people whose chimneys were shedding sparks in a way that suggested a negative future for the wooden deck. This was not glamorous work. It was, however, mercifully predictable, which made it ideal for lulling the mind. Funding such structures required creativity of a peculiarly sleepy sort. Rather than one large, decisive payment, bridges were maintained by a slow drizzle of piety and convenience. There were bridge brotherhoods, confraternities of local people who collected donations specifically for planks, mortar, and occasional improvements to the statue of a favorite saint at midspan. Pious travelers might drop a coin into a box marked for the health of the bridge, as if the structure were a mild, aging relative. Wills left small sums for a stone to be added, or a beam to be strengthened, alongside bequests for candles and masses, as though spiritual and structural illumination belonged on the same to-do list. Some bridges even had indulgences attached: contribute to repairs, gain a modest reduction in time spent in purgatorial traffic. It was salvation as infrastructure crowdfunding, where the reward tiers were measured in years off your soul's waiting room. The ledgers show an affection for itemization that borders on tender. We find purchases of 10 nails, then 12 more nails because someone underestimated. 2 carts of sand. A certain number of oak boards from a named forest. Payment for a man who removed an inconvenient tree stump upstream that kept catching debris and sending it into a pier like a passive-aggressive log. There is a kind of narrative here, but it moves extremely slowly. Winter damage, spring inspection, summer repair, autumn anxiety, and repeat. Occasionally, a storm or a flood sweeps through the margins of the text, but even then, the scribes respond with measured phrases. The third arch being somewhat disturbed, followed by line after line of reassurances about scheduled workdays. It is disaster literature rendered as a maintenance checklist. Naturally, there were rules about behavior on the bridge, drafted in the same patient style. Riders were requested not to gallop, carts not to overload, pigs not to roam unattended. At least one ordinance forbids drying fishnets over the railing, on the grounds that they made the place look untidy and confused visiting merchants. Another prohibits playing certain dice games on the span, suggesting that at some point a group of very relaxed gamblers decided the middle of a busy crossing was the perfect venue. Fines collected from such infractions were often, with satisfying circularity, directed back into the bridge fund. Misbehaving on the bridge helped pay for the bridge, a harmony of cause and effect that any modern budget committee might almost admire if it were not so fond of meetings. In Paris, on the Pont au Change and other bustling crossings, goldsmiths and money changers set up shop, their careful counting of coins accompanying the creak of wheels and the steady complaint of the river below. Their leases appear in documents with precise frontage measurements, proof that every inch of plank could be monetized. In London, early records around London Bridge describe houses so firmly settled along the roadway that travelers could forget they were on a bridge at all until they happened to glance down an alley and see water moving patiently under their daily business. These hybrid structures, half marketplace and half causeway, were loved and cursed for the same reason. They were never finished. Something always needed repair, adjustment, reinforcement. The persistence of the paperwork is the real monument. Stones and timbers came and went, but the instructions on who should show up with a hammer next Thursday survived. Even in small towns, a modest stone bridge became the focus of very local geopolitics of mud. Villagers upstream and downstream argued gently about whose livestock turned the approaches into a state of permanent damp, requiring extra gravel. Carters sought clarification on whether the toll applied per wheel or per load or per stubborn mule. These decisions were recorded in phrases that suggest nobody enjoyed arguing about them, yet everyone understood they mattered. Slightly more weight meant slightly more wear. One more herd driven across at the wrong time of year meant one more day of patching. There's a certain comfort in a world where collective effort is poured, quite literally, into preventing a hole from forming beneath your feet. Over time, new materials and engineering ideas crept into these sleepy narratives. Arches were widened, piers given cutwaters to deflect debris, iron cramps used to bind stones. The scribes did not change their tone. An entry about an innovative reinforcement technique sits calmly between notes on paying a boy to sweep leaves and the purchase of 2 new buckets. The extraordinary and the trivial share the same language, which is perhaps the best definition of infrastructure, the miraculous normalized. A bridge that stands through a difficult winter quietly adjusts trade, travel, and the chances of neighbors seeing one another. But the record shows only that 37 loads of stone were delivered and the mason received his due. Somewhere in Italy, caretakers of an old span over a very ordinary river recorded, with tangible satisfaction, the installation of iron chains across the roadway at night to prevent unapproved crossings after a certain hour. Not because of high crime or grand conspiracies, but because they preferred not to have carts loosen planks in the dark and then blame the bridge warden at dawn. The chains are mentioned 3 or 4 times, mainly in connection with the cost of oiling the padlocks. For a modern reader used to narratives about rise and fall, conquest and revolution, it is almost soothing to linger instead on this tiny ritual of closing the bridge, like tucking the town in. Unlocking it in the morning required no ceremony, just the slow removal of metal from metal, and perhaps a nod to the first carter waiting with a yawn and a load of cabbages. Elsewhere, an account from the Low Countries notes the employment of an official bridge sweeper, a man whose seasonal task was to remove layer after layer of horse droppings, windblown straw, and lost vegetable matter. He is budgeted not only a small wage, but a pair of shoes, justified in the margin by the phrase, because of dampness. The line is both pragmatic and faintly affectionate, acknowledging that spending your days between water and traffic is a wet business. Another entry explains that snow must be swept promptly to prevent dangerous ice and loud complaints, the last words, suggesting the scribes rated vocal dissatisfaction as almost as serious a hazard as slipping. All of it fits into the same steady rhythm, identify a small problem, assign a small solution, record it in ink like a promise that the world will behave tomorrow almost as it did today. Even sacred associations folded themselves into this bureaucracy of beams. Many big bridges have little shrines or chapels partway along, places where travelers could nod at a familiar saint while carts rattled past. Offerings left there frequently went to the bridge fund, turning devotion into maintenance with almost seamless efficiency. One popular patron of such spots promised protection from falling, which in a structure lined with shops, chimneys, and the occasional loose barrel rolling where it should not, was a sensible specialism. The surviving entries rarely mention miracles, but they do carefully total coins gathered on feast days. It is a quiet partnership, supernatural reassurance on one side, very natural purchase of replacement stone on the other, each keeping the traffic moving. Sometimes, in the margins of maps, we find notes about a broken bridge and an adjacent ferry, which means that for a while the careful maintenance chain failed. The reasons are seldom dramatic. More often they involve a harsh winter when funds were short, or the decay of a sponsoring institution. What is striking is how quickly people redesign their habits around the gap, crossing by boat until some new arrangement of patrons and taxes could rebuild the span. The river did not mind. It had always been there. The bridge's history, when you look closely, is not a triumphant line, but a series of attempts. For every famous stone arch that still stands, there were humbler structures that sagged, splintered, and vanished, leaving behind only a few lines about paying men to carry salvaged planks to a warehouse in case they might be useful elsewhere. Recycling before it had a slogan. As engineering and centralized states grew more confident, regulations thickened. Weight limits were posted, inspectors dispatched, designs standardized in ways that would have offended the cheerful regularity of earlier builders. Still, at ground level, the life of a bridge remained the same. Footsteps, hooves, wheels, the occasional stopped cart while someone retied a strap. New materials reduced some risks and added others, but the ledgers continued to track their slow lives with the same collection of small verbs: scraped, repaired, widened, cleaned, inspected, painted. The human desire to write down that something has been done, and done properly, persists regardless of whether the surface underfoot is oak, stone, or steel. It is, in itself, a kind of bridge between worry and reassurance. In the end, if you blur your gaze across centuries of such records, all the individual arches, piers, toll booths, and tiny fees blend into a calming pattern. People wanted to get from one side to another without too much trouble. Other people agreed to make this possible in exchange for small coins, small honors, or the quiet pride of seeing their name noted beside the words repaired or endowed. Water rose and fell, ice came and went, wheels changed from wooden to iron to rubber, yet the promise remained profoundly unexciting. This plank here will hold. That stone there will not move today. It is perhaps one of the gentlest threads in the whole fabric of history, this long, shared effort to make crossing so safe that you stop thinking about it altogether. So as you lie there listening, your mind can wander the length of some anonymous medieval bridge, past stalled carts and careful stalls, past a chapel lamp burning with oil paid for by yesterday's tolls, past a warden checking, once again, that no one has tied their goat where it should not be. The river below keeps its slow commentary. The ink in the records has faded to a comfortable brown. The arguments about nails and wheel ruts are over. All that remains is the enduring sense that someone, somewhere, took a great deal of care over each ordinary step, until the worry wore away and only the crossing was left, simple and assured, carrying you gently from this waking shore toward the quieter one on the other side. You might not expect a single wooden stick bolted to a market wall to decide the length of everyone's sleeves, but for several centuries that was essentially the case. In town after town, there was some official rod, usually not very impressive, sometimes cracked, occasionally repainted, that represented the one true measure of how much cloth you were actually buying. If you are still awake by the time we reach regional arguments about whose stick was holier, you are more than welcome to subscribe for more of this very calm retail content, though. It would be beautifully appropriate to fall asleep somewhere around the calibration stage and let the units drift quietly without you. The idea was simple enough. People bought fabric by the L, or the yard, or some other local unit, and nobody trusted anyone else's thumb. So authorities fixed a standard in public view. In some places it was carved into stone on a church wall. In others it was a metal bar darkened by 100 cautious fingertips. Elsewhere, a wooden rule hanging from the town hall, under the supervision of a clerk who wrote his name on things more often than strictly necessary. A buyer could walk up, press the merchant's portable measuring stick against the official one, and check whether reality aligned with the promise. It was the medieval equivalent of checking if the scale at the grocery store is rigged, only much quieter and with more wool. These standards were given dignified titles like the King, a cell, or the Sworn Measure, which is an impressively serious name for a long piece of wood. The trouble, which unfolded at a wonderfully sleepy pace, was that every place seemed to like its L a little different. One town had an L of 54 centimeters, another leaned closer to 69, another had a version that wandered pleasantly above 70. Some regions kept an L of the realm, and then, just to stay interesting, a cloth L, slightly longer, because fabric people allegedly needed more optimism. Traders traveling from city to city carried bundles of measuring rods like a magician with very boring props, each inscribed with its home origin, its alleged correctness, and sometimes a discreet initial so it could be matched to the right lawsuit later. You get a sense of the low-level mental gymnastics involved in selling someone a fabric for a sleeve without inadvertently funding a complaint to magistrates. Local councils responded in their favorite way, with ordinances. Do not cut cloth except by the sworn L. Do not keep false L's. Do not shave your L at the ends. Some rules specify that measuring rods must be of iron or of well-seasoned wood, as though the problem so far had been excessively emotional timber. Inspectors were appointed, often with titles suggesting solemnity beyond their tasks. They went from stall to stall comparing sticks, a job that appears in the records as if it were a perfectly normal way for a human life to proceed. In some towns, these officials carried the official L around with them in a leather case, like a portable sense of justice. When they found a short measure, the punishment varied. Sometimes the rod was broken in public, a small ceremony of embarrassment. Sometimes there was a fine. Sometimes the merchant had to stand beside the real L for a while, presumably contemplating the ideal of accuracy. The physicality of all this is oddly comforting. In an age of fluctuating coinage and creative weights, the L stuck to its role with stubborn simplicity, a straight line, something you could touch. People met under its authority. Guilds swore to use it. Testimonies mentioned it as calmly as they mentioned the weather. In one city, the official L was fixed right next to the main church entrance, so that you could, on the same stone facade, check the measure of your cloth and contemplate eternity, both calibrated by carefully carved marks. There are notes of repairs, the L being worn at the edges, recut, re-ruled, re-blessed with bureaucracy. You can picture a mason trying earnestly to make the new marks match the old ones, using string, and care, and perhaps a patient sigh when a gust of wind nudged his hand. The consequences of a millimeter's deviation were not catastrophic, but people paid attention anyway. Of course, merchants were not always villains of short measure. They were also victims of everyone else's creative arithmetic. A cloth seller who bought in one city and sold in another had to run his own internal exchange rate, turning L's into other L's like someone murmuring currency conversions in a jet-lagged haze. Treatises tried to help, tidy tables explaining that so many Paris L's equaled so many Vienna L's, and so on, as if the world would obediently follow columns of ink. In practice, people rounded. About became a key unit. Deals were lubricated with mutual tolerance. If the bolt looked long and the buyer trusted the face across the counter, nobody fetched the official stick. Trust, in that context, was simply the decision to not go and stare at the piece of iron on the wall again. Now and then, higher authorities attempted harmonization. A king might declare that henceforth his realm recognized one official L, behold it, carved into palace stone. The announcement sounded grand, yet out in the smaller towns, the old links clung on. For a village that had spent 3 generations buying fabric measured against the same wooden bar in the same stall, the notion that distant people in better hats had decided all their sleeves should be recalculated was of theoretical interest at best. So you get this softly chaotic map of coexisting exactitudes. Royal L's, city L's, guild L's, each correct in its own bubble. Cloth moved among them like a very patient traveler with multiple passports. In shop interiors, the working L's developed personalities. Some had brass caps to prevent fraying. Some had darkened from hands. Some carried scratch marks carved by apprentices during slow afternoons. The act of measuring became a shared ritual. Bolt laid out, rod smoothed along, cut made with a practiced slice, small scraps kept aside for laces or linings. Over years, that motion repeated until it sank below consciousness. The L on the wall and the L in the hand trained each other. A cutter could feel when a piece was wrong by less than a finger's width, not because he had counting powers, but because the repetition had settled into muscle memory. As unremarked and exact as the way you reach for a familiar light switch in the dark, there were, nestled in this calm, small absurdities that only make sense half asleep. One ordinance forbade heating your measuring rod near the fire, a hint that someone, somewhere, discovered that warm wood lengthens just enough to be suspiciously generous. Another required that the sworn L be brought along during major market fairs to reassure foreign merchants, conjuring the image of a dignitary standing by a booth, displaying a rod as if it were a celebrity. There is at least one anecdote of 2 towns jokingly accusing each other of using dishonest L's, a sort of early modern version of arguing that your neighbor's rulers are wrong because their furniture doesn't align. These stories never crescendo into anything dramatic. They just ripple gently along the surface of trade. Tailors lived at the intersection of all this measuring and human geometry. They took cloth cut by one L and tried to fit it to bodies measured by others. Manuals show systems of fractions and marks, cautious diagrams of doublets and gowns, annotated with numbers that assume everyone agrees what one means. In a quiet way, every well-fitting garment was a peace treaty between abstractions. When it failed, when sleeves sat too short or hems too high, the complaint might trace back, not to the tailor's hand, but to the unseen decision made years earlier about where exactly to carve a notch in a piece of stone. The wearer seldom knew. They only tugged their cuffs and wondered if perhaps they had grown. As industrialization crept in, the chaos of local measures began to irritate more ambitious people. Factories wanted bolts of predictable length. Railways, with their tidy timetables and iron regularity, had no patience for a system where a yard meant whatever the nearest church wall had decided. Committees formed, reports were written in a tone of dignified exasperation, and standards began to harden into something like modern uniformity. Some nations formalized their L's and yards as exact fractions of new base units. Others adopted the metric system outright, unleashing a wave of printed tables explaining that what had once been a royal L was now so many centimeters, inviting the population to pretend this was intuitive. The old public rods, suddenly redundant, drifted into a kind of retirement. A few were preserved as curiosities, encased in glass with labels for visiting school children. Others remained bolted to church walls where nobody consulted them anymore, slowly eroding alongside faint carved initials and dates. If you walk past them now, you might not notice at all. Or if you do, you might assume they are decorative moldings or part of some forgotten allegory. Their quiet authority has evaporated. Sleeves and curtains are still cut, of course, and tape measures still stretch along counters. But the emotional weight has leaked away from any one stick. Accuracy migrated into numbers we print on packaging without thinking. There is something gently pleasing in this whole story being, from beginning to end, almost entirely about avoiding minor unfairness in how much linen people took home. No empires hinge on it, no cathedrals fall. Instead, we have centuries of scribes, traders, tailors, and town councils cooperating, arguing, and recalibrating over margins of cloth so small that you could forget them before you reached your front door. They wrote rules, they carved stone, they organized inspections. The world continued to turn, largely indifferent, but in their small squares and cramped shops they made a shared promise. When we say an L, we will try, honestly, to mean an L. And now, as you lie there, perhaps half listening, you can imagine these markets as they settle at dusk. The stalls are shuttered, the bolts rolled up, the measuring rods laid flat. Somewhere on a wall, an old standard owl rests, its carved marks catching the last of the light. The day's tiny negotiations over length are over. No one is comparing sticks. No one is worrying about whether this sleeve or that sheet is a fraction longer. The numbers fade into the background hum of crickets and distant wheels. What remains is only a long, calm line reaching out across time, steady and unhurried, inviting your thoughts to stretch along it until they too grow quiet and still. You might not expect the history of unclaimed mail to be soothing, but in the quieter corners of old post offices there were rooms full of parcels and letters that never quite found their people, resting on shelves in a kind of accidental museum of everyday intentions. Their stories were almost never dramatic. They were mostly about wrong numbers on streets that had no numbers yet, or names written in flourished ink that no one could decipher, or towns so common that the clerks were left staring at Springfield or St. Martin and wondering which one the sender had meant. If you are still awake by the time we reach the regulations for how long a package of dried plums was allowed to sit before being considered philosophically abandoned, you are gently invited to subscribe for more of this series, though please do not feel compelled to stay conscious in order to do so. Sleeping through a postal inventory is arguably the purest form of participation in the beginning. Postal systems imagine themselves as swift, purposeful veins of communication. Couriers carried locked bags along set routes, changing horses, signing receipts with some confidence that documents and small parcels would get where they were supposed to go. But as volume increased and geography refused to become less confusing, something inevitable appeared. The letter that arrived and then stopped. It was addressed to Johann, the shoemaker near the big tree, long after the big tree had been cut down, or to Madame Laurent, opposite the church, in a town with 3 churches and multiple optimistic Laurents. Clerks whose job descriptions leaned heavily toward not guessing set these puzzles aside for later. Later needed a place to sit. Thus the first dead letter shelves began, not morbid, just politely suspended. Regulations followed, in that patient tone beloved of administrators. Letters that could not be delivered were to be held for a set time, 3 months, 6 months, a year, depending on region and era. Notices were sometimes posted on public boards, listing surnames and vague hints, like a very slow analog notification tab. Some offices kept special registers of these orphaned items, writing short descriptions in looping handwriting, small packet tied with blue string, sender in Ghent, contents unknown, or letter from abroad, address incomplete. seal intact. The clerks were required to copy the information with as much accuracy as possible, thereby ensuring that even a misaddressed note about missing socks could enjoy a moment of official immortality. The shelves grew tidier, not emptier. In a quiet way, each failed delivery became a tiny piece of the institution's proof that it cared. Opening the letters was a serious matter. Many systems allowed it only after a generous waiting period, and only under supervision to search for clues that might reveal a better address. There's something wonderfully gentle about this: a table, 2 or 3 officials, and a pile of envelopes, each slit with careful blades, not out of nosiness, but as an act of rescue. Inside they might find a street name, finely written clearly in the body if not on the cover, or reference to a relative in a specific town, or, quite commonly, absolutely nothing helpful at all. One 19th century report notes the disappointing frequency of letters that began immediately with, "as you already know," thereby defeating the entire investigative purpose. Still, the process went on like a ritual of second chances. Occasionally, money orders emerged, or jewelry or folded fabric samples, which were then recorded in longer, calmer lists. Every coin and trinket entered as if balancing a sleepy ledger between trust and lost opportunity. Packages were their own category of indecision. A misdirected box might contain books, tools, or food. The books and tools posed only spatial questions: where to put them on the shelves, which number to assign, which volume of the catalog to update so that anyone, in theory, could locate creative ironmongery, possibly destined for lion, awaiting clarification. Food, however, raised more immediate philosophical issues about time, smell, and responsibility. Regulations emerged specifying that perishable items could be kept only for so long before being either destroyed or, in some systems, sold off with the proceeds held for the rightful owner should they ever appear. This leads to the very quiet absurdity of civil servants composing rules about how to auction slightly stale biscuits, whose original journey had already failed. Meeting minutes record these decisions without a hint of comedy, folding them into the same tone used for route planning and salary scales dot in certain countries. The undeliverable letters all flowed inward toward a central office, often in the capital, where they were sorted again into categories of hopelessness. Rooms were arranged with rows of pigeonholes and cupboards, labeled by initial, by region, sometimes by vague themes. The effect must have been like walking into a library where all the books were, missing their titles and occasionally their endings. Clerks navigated this landscape with an unhurried expertise, retrieving envelopes from El Domestic, more than 1-year-old, or sliding a newly arrived puzzle into unidentified foreign script. Training manuals advised them in recognizing handwriting styles and common mistakes, patiently explaining that Paris and Pavia have been confused, that Lisbon occasionally meant Lisbon, but sometimes a village with a similar name, that senders forgot to mention countries as if the postal service were expected to sense these things. The work rewarded those who enjoyed patterns, repetition, and the modest satisfaction of correctly guessing a missing detail dot when all attempts failed. There was disposal or transformation. In many systems, truly dead letters were eventually destroyed to protect privacy, which they did in the least dramatic way possible. Controlled burning, supervised shredding, tidy reports. Occasionally, useful contents were salvaged. Money went into special accounts, safely quarantined. Items of general utility, like plain cloth or tools, might be handed over to charitable institutions. There are ledgers describing how much was collected and where it went, proving that even the byproducts of miscommunication were filed and categorized. What might sound tragic, a message never read, a gift never opened, becomes, in these documents, another line in a calm budget. Emotion doesn't vanish. It is just translated into columns. Some of the more endearing details emerge in the edges of this system. There are references to letters addressed to fictional characters, which occasionally arrived in surprising numbers. The post office, perhaps out of curiosity, kept them for a while, then stored them among other ambiguities. There were notes from children to distant monarchs, lovingly filed as undeliverable but not discarded until their administrative patience wore thin. One office politely explained in an internal memo that letters addressed simply to the inventor of a certain useful device, unknown to me, could not be efficiently processed. Another described its experience with envelopes bearing only drawings of houses or rivers instead of words, which clerks examine like gentle detectives trying to match sketches to real landscapes. If this all sounds like something invented to be charming, it is only because bureaucracy, given enough time and paper, accidentally produces whimsy. The people who worked in these departments led lives threaded through with the quiet notion that messages often fail, but systems must not. Their tools were straightedges, registers, alphabetical indexes, and an ability to remain unmoved by both sentiment and tedium. Yet even they sometimes left traces of personality, a marginal note about an especially stubborn handwriting style, a rare exclamation mark beside a case finally resolved after years, the neat underlining of regulations that had clearly been misunderstood once too often. Their days followed a smooth pattern: open, examine, record, file, repeat. No single item demanded urgency. Together they formed a soft, continuous hum of attempted order. As more people learned to write, the volume of mail increased, and so did this backlog of misfires. The 19th century, in particular, saw post offices struggling not only with speed and scale, but with the proliferation of near-identical names. Cities published polite suggestions encouraging senders to include middle initials, full addresses, and ideally legible letters. The suggestions were ignored just often enough to keep the undeliverable rooms comfortably stocked. Improvements in transportation and address systems gradually helped, but never finished the task. There was always another envelope missing a house number, another parcel addressed simply to the kind doctor who treated my aunt last summer. The persistence of such faith is oddly touching. People trusted that intention plus postage, plus a few vague clues might be enough. With the arrival of standardized addressing, postal codes, and mechanized sorting, the character of dead letters changed shape, but did not disappear. Machines could read lines of type with ruthless consistency, but stumbled on flourishes of ink still favored by nostalgic senders. Automated systems spat their doubts into separate bins, recreating in modern plastic the old wooden pigeonholes of uncertainty. Regulations thickened. Time limits were adjusted. Digital records replaced hand-drawn ledgers. Still somewhere, staff opened envelopes in well-lit rooms, locked contents into databases, and tried a last time to connect scattered information into successful deliveries. The language updated, but the underlying rhythm remained. Hold, hope, decide. Clear space for tomorrow's mistakes. If you follow this thread long enough, it becomes less about individual letters and more about the comfort of knowing that somewhere there is a place for things that don't quite arrive. The dead letter offices were never truly dead. They were transitional spaces designed to absorb the friction between human imprecision and institutional expectation. They stood quietly between people who meant well and systems that preferred specifics. In their shelves, you find the outlines of forgotten journeys, a hat sent back for reshaping, a cookbook meant as a gift, an invoice that missed its due date by a comfortable decade, a pressed flower whose colors only the sender and nobody else ever saw in time.now as you breathe a little slower. You can imagine walking past those shelves in some late 19th century building as the clerks cover the ink pots and close the cabinets for the night. The city outside is dim, the streets quieter, the bags of tomorrow's mail stacked neatly. Behind one office door, rows of unclaimed parcels and letters sit very still, addressed to half-remembered places, to misspelled names, to houses that have since changed their curtains. Nothing urgent demands attention. The regulations have been followed. The logs are up to date. The shelves hold their small confusion with complete composure, and you can let your thoughts drift there for a while. Among those carefully numbered bundles of almost delivered words until their stillness seeps into you, and every unanswered message, every unfinished errand, and every slightly wrong address gently loosens its hold and fades into the dark. You might not expect the height of a stone spout to decide how politely people argued at sunrise, but for a long time the public fountain was exactly that kind of quiet referee. In hundreds of towns, from hot limestone hillsides to cold northern valleys, the day began not with coffee, but with buckets and with a slow, organized shuffle toward the one place where clean water spilled out on purpose. If you manage to stay awake all the way until we get to the regulation about how long a donkey was, allowed to stand under a dripping trough before being fined, you are very welcome to subscribe for more of this gentle hydraulic bureaucracy. Honestly, though, surrendering to sleep somewhere around the bucket rotation rules would match the historical mood perfectly. The early fountains were practical promises, carved in stone. If you walk here, if you wait your turn, the town will give you water. Many of them were fed by long, unseen channels from springs on distant slopes, guided along gradients calculated with a kind of patient genius that looked suspiciously like guesswork, but usually worked. The water arrived in basins and spouts with a soft, regular sound that people grew around like plants. Clothes were washed nearby, animals brought close but not too close. Jars filled for cooking, for brewing, for cooling the inside of clay pitchers in summer. To prevent all this from turning instantly into chaos, councils drafted rules. They wrote them down very carefully, as if the fate of civilization depended on whether goats had the right to step into the shallows. They did not. A typical fountain ordinance reads like a lullaby for municipal order. No washing of offal or hides in the upper basin. No rinsing of chamber pots where drinking water falls. No dyeing of cloth with aggressive colors on feast days. Draw from the first spout for people, the second for animals, the lower trough for washing, in that order as if the fountain itself were a small tiered society. Offenders could be fined in coins or more often, in shame, their names spoken out in council, their bad behavior briefly public before sinking back into anonymity. You can picture someone standing with a dripping bucket while a neighbor mutters that regulations clearly state pigs should be watered downstream. Not here, at this very noble stone lip intended for Christians and onions. The arguments rarely escalate. They just fold into the rhythm of the place. Whole jobs grew out of these little jets of water. There was the fountain keeper, sometimes called the guardian or warden of the spring, whose responsibilities included clearing leaves from the channels, checking for cracks, and, importantly, being available for blame. When the flow slowed, people complained to him. When it ran too fast and splashed, people complained to him differently. In some cities, he had the right to enforce queue order, an authority exercised with all the weary dignity of someone who has told the same 3 families for 15 years that the line begins at the left, not the right. He might lock the fountain at night with a metal grate, tiny keys hanging at his belt, because someone once tried to bathe loudly at midnight and it had to be stopped. In return, he received a small salary, the occasional gift, and the faint satisfaction of knowing that, without him, theoretically, everything would dry up to the design of the fountains. Once you start noticing it, seems almost tailored to slow the mind. Basins are often rounded, encouraging people to stand in arcs rather than confrontational lines. Spouts trickle at rates determined long ago by masons with an eye for both stone and patience. Inscriptions curve around the edges, serenely reminding users that the water is a blessing, a civic achievement, or in some cases sponsored by a particular person eager to be remembered every time a bucket is dipped. Dates are carved but have no urgency. They simply state that in year so-and-so, the town arranged for water to fall here. Passing fingers have smoothed the edges. Moss softens the cracks. The whole structure hums a message. Nothing important is happening, but what must happen will slowly. Inevitably, there were small absurdities. Regulations in one Italian town banned the washing of dogs of little value in the main basin, a phrase that suggests arguments about canine worth conducted while ankles were getting splashed. Elsewhere, a rule insisted that all buckets must be lowered by hand and not by rope with hooks, after someone decided that swinging metal near people's faces at a crowded water source was too exciting. Some places posted exact times during which people could soak beans or vegetables at the lower trough. To prevent legumes from monopolizing the infrastructure, the thought of a clerk quill scratching his way through the phrase, "no chickpeas after prime," is, all by itself, the kind of detail that loosens the muscles behind your eyes. In cities with several fountains, hierarchies developed. One served the richer quarter with cleaner stone and perhaps a decorative statue. Another, more worn, catered to artisans. A third, near the animals' market, accepted hooves and mud without complaint. Town records discuss moving spouts, raising edges, adding additional outlets for the convenience of the people, in the same toneless style with which they discuss fortifications and tax rates. The infrastructure of thirst sat quietly beside that of defense. When a new fountain opened, there might be a blessing, some Latin words, a priest flicking water back at the water, and then life resumed with slightly shorter carrying distances. It was celebration measured in fewer tiring steps. Engineers of aqueducts and underground pipes, those pragmatic magicians of gradient and leak, appear in the archives with lovely calm. They surveyed with water levels and strings, traced channels, specified lime for mortar, requested wooden forms for arches. Reports of their work arrive without adjectives. The conduit from the hill spring being completed, the junction cleaned, the sediment basin enlarged. What they were actually doing was tying unseen knots in the landscape so that a woman leaning over a stone lip in August could fill a jug without thinking. Their signatures are tucked away at the bottom of pages that most eyes skimmed. Meanwhile, the fountain's visible face became part of ordinary memory, like a landmark in a recurring dream. With the coming of pipes into private houses, the public fountains adjusted instead of vanishing. Wealthier homes drilled into the new systems first, but the basins and the squares continued to serve those who remained firmly bucket-based. In some places, the pressure increased. In others, it decreased. Discussions ensued involving charmingly incomplete knowledge of hydraulics. Was the water lazier because too many households had taken their own streams, or because silt had lined the upper channel? A committee formed naturally and produced a report suggesting both more and less cleaning. Through it all, the fountain keeper continued sweeping, adjusting, and listening to people who were convinced that water had feelings. Some fountains gained clocks above them, or were built into the walls beneath municipal bell towers, bringing together time and water in one convenient place. You could learn both the hour and your relative hydration status with a single glance. Travelers met there, letter carriers paused there, notices were pinned nearby. There are sketches from the 18th and 19th centuries in which fountains appear not as subjects but as background, a curve of stone in the corner, a suggestion of a basin where indistinct people are always almost filling something. This too says something about their role. Once reliable, a fountain becomes invisible until it stops, much like the hum of a refrigerator, or the steady signal at the top of your screen that says you are connected. The etiquette of waiting your turn at these basins, although rarely written down in full, settled into consistent shapes. A newcomer would stand a little back and to the side, acknowledging those already leaning in. Eye contact might be minimal. Commentary about the weather mandatory. Children were instructed not to climb into the trough no matter how hot. Buckets queued in front of their owners, a simple portable line. The sound of water covered pauses. In its way, the scene resembles a very early social network, daily, repetitive, low-stakes interactions happening around a shared resource nobody wanted to think about too intensely. The posts were shorter, but the principle familiar. By the time industrial filtering and chlorination entered the picture, public fountains had shifted once more, some becoming decorative, others retrofitted as official taps. New plaques appeared extolling cleanliness. Older inscriptions about piety looked on, unbothered. In some cities, ornate 19th century basins with lion head spouts joined their medieval cousins, expressing a confidence in cast iron and symmetry that earlier builders never imagined. The rules about pigs faded. The rules about water quality thickened into layers of laboratory results and permitted parts per million. Yet if you stand beside one of these newer fountains late in the evening, when hardly anybody passes, the sensation is oddly the same, a steady murmuring fall, a small piece of gravity domesticated. All these centuries of flow, when laid end to end in the mind, do not produce a story with a climax. Instead, they drift like a long, clear channel through daily life. People carry, pour, spill. They talk, complain, flirt, ignore. They dip their hands, their ladles, sometimes their thoughts. Petitions to councils ask for repairs. Budgets allocate modest sums. Masons and plumbers arrive with tools that change shape over time but serve the same intention. The fountains are there when children grow, when markets move, when borders change. They are there when languages shift in the square around them. They anchor nothing dramatic. They just keep everyone from being too thirsty. So as you rest, you can let your mind idle beside one of these basins in some imaginary town stitched together from many real ones. It is very early or very late. The stone is cool. The trickle is steady. A forgotten sign still warns, in 3 languages, not to wash certain things here. The guardian has gone home, his keys quiet on a hook. No one is jostling for position. The channels under the streets continue guiding thin sheets of water toward this one simple exit into the air. You listen without needing to move. The regulations, the measurements, the arguments about buckets and beans all dissolve into that soft sound until there is only the reassurance that something older than your worries is still running and will continue to run even as your thoughts slow down, lengthen and slip away. You might not expect a mossy stone at the edge of a field to have a longer and calmer career than most kings, but boundary stones are very patient like that, all day, all night, through wars, weddings, and changes in hat fashion. They stand in the same unremarkable spot and say the same unremarkable thing, here, and no further, unless we all agree about it very politely on paper. If you're somehow still awake by the time we drift onto the subject of 18th century rules for repainting faded initials, you are gently invited to subscribe for more of this. But honestly, do not put pressure on yourself. Nodding off while someone explains property markers is entirely in the spirit of the topic. For a long time, owning land was less about satellite images and more about remembering which tree, ditch, or stone meant what. People pointed, from that big oak to the bend in the stream, from the bend in the stream to the flat rock that looks like a loaf of bread, from the loaf to that other tree, and so on until everyone agreed they had circled the estate. The problem, which emerged slowly and predictably, was that trees died, streams moved, loaves were reinterpreted, and memories insisted on being human. So communities did the sensible, boring, ingenious thing. They put it into stone. They set up small markers, sometimes knee-high, sometimes waist-high, carved with letters, symbols, or little crosses, and declared that these were no longer just rocks. They were witnesses. Quiet, illiterate witnesses who nevertheless outranked. Most arguments thought the ceremonies around placing these stones were serious and faintly adorable. Records describe groups of men and occasionally puzzled children walking the boundaries together on designated days. At each marker, they would stop, recite a description, and sometimes give a small symbolic tap to the stone with the staff, as if waking it up and reminding it of its responsibilities. In some regions, they lifted the younger boys up and bumped them gently against the boundary stones or the adjacent trees, intending that the discomfort, or at least the oddness, would make them remember the exact spot as adults. It was a human backup drive when the parchment got damp and the ink went pale. You could summon someone who recalled being deliberately thumped near a particular stone on a hot afternoon and trust his testimony. The stones themselves rarely show any urgency about all this. Many were carved with just a couple of initials, the name of a landowner, a monastery, a town. Others bore simple symbols, a cross, a crown, a stylized tool. Some marked where one jurisdiction ended and another began, carrying letters on two faces so each side could feel represented. Placed along roads and hedgerows, on hill crests and riverbanks, they made invisible lines slightly less imaginary. Surveyors of later centuries noted them on maps, little dots with abbreviations that meant more to tax clerks than to travelers. To the casual passerby, they were simply stones that looked a little too purposeful to be natural, as if someone had once cared exactly how far a particular field extended and then gone inside for supper, never imagining you would be lying in bed listening to their disputes. When they did occur, unfolded at an impressive walking speed, one party would claim that the true boundary ran a little further yonder, a distance measured in steps, not meters. The other party would counter by pointing solemnly at the stone that had always been there. Meetings were held. Parchments were brought out, their edges carefully unfolded. Committees walked from marker to marker, reading aloud descriptions that began to sound like incantations, from the old ash stump, now fallen, to the stone bearing the sign of the fish, thence to the large stone in the hedge where three parishes meet. Sometimes they concluded that the stone had indeed been moved, probably by someone with strong opinions and a lever. In that case, it was moved back in a small, unspectacular correction of geography. No fireworks, just a handful of people watching a rock travel a few feet toward what they considered truth. Boundary stones at borders, between bigger units' lordships, bishoprics, states acquired slightly more ceremony but the same basic personality. They were occasionally decorated with coats of arms, dates, or Latin phrases reminding viewers of who was in charge here and whose tax collector you would meet if you stepped across. Some showed a double-headed eagle on one side, a lion or fleur-de-lis on the other, like a very heavy diplomatic handshake. There were even treaties specifying exactly where such stones should stand, at the third bend of the river, on the ridge between two valleys, beside the old beech tree, which once again brought everyone back to the problem of trees having personal schedules. Hence the trust placed in stone. Stone was slow. Stone seemed safe. The micromanagement of these markers reached charming heights. In some places, local ordinances required periodic inspection to ensure they had not sunk, tilted, or been hidden behind enthusiastic vegetation. Villagers were expected not to plow them under, not to set them up as improvised stools far from their rightful line, and not to chip bits off for building projects. Fines existed for boundary stone damage. a phrase that promises drama but usually delivered. Nothing more than someone having attempted to straighten a wobbly marker with the subtlety of a cow. There are court records where witnesses debate whether a stone now half buried was once higher, and if so, whether that counts as relocation. The discussions are slow, polite, and gloriously lacking in suspense. Surveying improved over the centuries. Chains, compasses, and theodolites joined the conversation. Maps grew more detailed. Coordinates began to appear, yet the old stones were not retired. Instead, surveyors used them as reference points. A quiet feedback loop emerged in which the stones confirmed the maps, and the maps confirmed the stones. Even when new boundary markers were installed, formal posts with numbers, painted metal plates, concrete blocks with bureaucratic charm, the older ones were left alongside, a palimpsest of authority. If you have ever noticed two different markers within a few meters of each other, one ancient and lichen-covered, the other squarer and helpfully numbered, you've seen this duet of eras, medieval here-ish and modern here to 3 decimal places. Some stones acquired minor local legends, not because they did anything, but because people disliked silence. It was said that moving one would bring misfortune, not due to any mystical power, but because it would bring paperwork. In one village, children were warned that sitting on the boundary stone at dusk would cause them to grow up indecisive, which might have been a half joke about the difficulty of choosing sides. In another, lovers were told that meeting at the stone where 3 parishes met was unlucky, perhaps because nobody wanted to untangle the question of which priest would handle the consequences. These stories drifted around the stones like mist, never quite thick enough to change their duties. In forests and mountains, boundary markers multiplied into long, quiet chains, cairns on ridges, blazed trees, numbered posts leading along contours. Rangers and shepherds used them to know where their responsibilities ended. Hikers would later follow the same signs without thinking, tracing agreements older than their maps. Often the markers were nothing more than knee-high rocks with a letter and a number. Space so that if you stood at one, you could just see the next, turning the landscape into a slow-motion connect-the-dots puzzle. The work of placing them involved days of carrying, hammering, aligning with compasses under clouds, and writing reports about gradients. The result was a system that allowed 2 people, starting from nowhere in particular, to meet halfway at a stone both agreed mattered. Urban versions were subtler, but just as committed. On city walls, inconspicuous crosses or inscriptions showed where one parish stopped and another began, which mattered for taxes, repairs, and funeral rites. On bridges, little carved shields divided maintenance duties between authorities. Even on some buildings, marks indicated where a neighboring property's right ended, so future masons would know how far they could extend a new staircase without provoking a gently worded complaint. Generations walked past these invitations to minor accuracy without noticing them, stepping over literal lines that existed mainly in the minds of notaries. The arrival of GPS and digital mapping did not put the boundary stone out of work. It merely reassigned its role. Where before the stone was the definition, now it is both relic and checkpoint. Surveyors stand over it with devices that talk to satellites, pressing buttons to ensure that the coordinates on their screens match the stubborn rock that has been saying, "Here," since long before orbital anything. If it does not match, the debate resumes in a thoroughly modern way, invoking reference systems and transformation grids. But at heart, it is the same old conversation, whether the world on paper has drifted too far from the world underfoot. There is no grand twist at the end of this. Nothing explodes. No famous battle is decided by a boundary stone heroically holding its position. Instead, the history of these objects is a long, very gentle attempt to externalize memory so that future arguments can be shorter and less shouty. Generations of people agreed that it was worth the trouble to carve initials into hard material, to walk the lines together now and then, to correct the occasional wobble. The reward was modest but real. Fields that stayed the same size from one spring to the next. Taxes collected with fewer surprises. Paths that did not suddenly become forbidden because someone had a creative interpretation of a little further yonder. So if, as you lie there, your thoughts are still wandering a bit, you can let them move slowly along one of those old lines. Picture a hedgerow, a row of low stones, a ditch that might be natural or might be legal. Every so often, a marker rises, chipped, tilted, but present. Maybe there are letters you can't quite read, like in turning them into soft shapes. Beyond it, another stone waits, exactly where some patient group once decided it should be. No one is hurrying. The air is mild. The line continues over the next small hill, then the next as far as it needs to, content with its own quiet correctness. You do not have to follow it to the end. It is enough to know that it is there, steady and uninterested in your deadlines, while your mind, having walked a short stretch of its length, gradually slows to the same pace and settles. You might not expect the tiny numbers on the spine of a book to have their own slow, wandering history, but whole centuries quietly agreed to line up their thoughts according to codes so small you can cover them with your thumb. If you're somehow still awake by the time we get to the question of why one 19th century librarian devoted 3 meetings to deciding whether beekeeping belongs closer to agriculture or moral improvement, you are very welcome to subscribe for more of this, but please don't strain anything. Dozing off between decimal points is exactly the sort of respectful engagement these systems were built to inspire. Before there were printed numbers, there were shelves that made sense only to the person who owned them. A monastery might keep its books in armoria, cupboards recessed into the walls, each one with its own habit of arrangement. Thick books at the bottom, fragile ones at the top, important ones near the abbot, troublesome ones slightly out of reach. Sometimes a little tag sewn to the binding or written on the first page told you which cupboard and which row. These earliest shelf marks were more like gentle reminders than commands. Press A, shelf 3, 5th from left, as if the page were muttering directions to anyone patient enough to follow. The system worked as long as no one moved, no one died, and no one decided that, actually, sermons should sit closer to grammar because they borrowed phrases. Unfortunately, people are reliable only in their unreliability, so adjustments happened. Each adjustment needed a new set of marks, and the marks accumulated like geological layers, old letters scratched out, new letters squeezed in, everyone pretending it was perfectly clear that B.I.I.F.OI, Emma.I.I.D meant here. As collections grew, especially in universities, the problem became pleasantly tedious. You had more books than one memory could hold, but fewer than justified outright chaos. Librarians, who were often scholars themselves, tried to arrange volumes by subject or by format, or by how much they personally liked the author. Catalogs were written listing each work followed by an instruction such as cupboard 2 lower, near the window, which only made sense if you knew which room they meant and which window they had not later bricked up. Still, there is something soothing about the idea of a reader shuffling down a dim corridor counting armaria, fingers gliding over wooden doors, guided by someone else's quiet handwriting. The system did not have to be universal. It only had to be true this week. Over time, shelf marks took on a more official tone. Libraries began painting codes on the bottom edges of books so they could be seen when the volumes were stacked with spines inward. An early reminder that practicality outranks dignity. Small paper labels appeared, pasted and repasted as shelves were rearranged. Some institutions used Roman numerals for presses, letters for shelves, and running numbers for each item. Others reversed the order as a subtle test of loyalty. There were debates and measured voices about whether it was better to group by size to prevent tall books bullying short ones, or by topic to make all the maps sit together and whisper among themselves. The compromise, which lasted for generations, was to do a little of everything and explain it in a preface. Nobody outside the staff ever fully read Dot when printing boomed in serious libraries, started collecting not dozens but thousands of volumes. An almost comforting crisis arrived. You cannot simply stack 8,000 titles where they fit and expect anyone, including yourself, to find that one treatise about turnip rotation again. So classification schemes began to unfurl. Some early ones were idiosyncratic masterpieces, long lists of subjects branching into subtopics, each assigned a letter or number. Theology, philosophy, history, law, natural sciences, arts, literature, all given their own territories on the shelves. A book about the moral implications of mining might end up at the border of theology and geology, where inspectors of both would occasionally come to check on it. The beauty here is not that anyone's system was perfect, but that so many people believed, very gently, that perfection lay just one more subdivision away. Shelf marks became addresses. A spine might read D416, which to the uninitiated means nothing, but to the librarian murmurs, fourth press of the D range. 16th volume, please turn left at the big atlas and mind the step. Catalog entries now included both a description of the book and this coded location, so that the act of finding it resembled following a treasure map, where the treasure is a moderately interesting sermon. There is a deep, sleep-friendly satisfaction in that small transformation. Thought into paper, paper into order, order into coordinates. Reaching the right book feels less like luck and more like participating in a very slow, puzzle ancient strangers designed for you. Then came the enthusiastic classifiers. People who looked at a room full of books and saw not clutter but an opportunity to number everything with dizzying precision. They broke knowledge into main classes, each assigned a digit or letter, then subdivided into smaller and smaller segments until the categories resembled tree branches viewed too closely. A treatise on the chemistry of bread might receive one code. A sociological study of bakers' guilds, another. The charm lies in the assumption that every topic, no matter how specific, say, municipal regulations concerning ornamental ducks in public ponds, could be fitted somewhere, if one only had the patience to follow the branching instructions. Libraries adopting such systems pasted tiny, neat labels on spines, a short stack of characters converting chaos into shelving instructions. The shelves themselves, once just wood, became a landscape of coordinates. Of course, reality continued to be less obedient than charts. Books refused to be of only one subject. A history of astronomy written by a theologian who spent half his time describing angels causes problems for any scheme that prefers boundaries. Librarians, practical mystics that they are, invented cross-references. The catalog would say, see also, see instead. See under this other code if you were that kind of reader. Copies of overused volumes were shelved in two places at once, a luxurious redundancy. When a shelf filled, numbers had to stretch to accommodate the newcomers, creating little eddies in the sequence. 821.3, 821.31, 821.311. Like someone whispering just a bit more to the edge of a ruler. There were quiet arguments, all held outdoors of public attention. Should travel books live with geography or with literature? Where do you file a book on the etiquette of scientific meetings? Is a cookbook about monastery soups primarily theology, gastronomy, or architecture if half the pages are about cloisters? Committees met, minutes were taken, outcomes noted in circulars that very few people kept, but many followed. It is a comforting thought experts debating earnestly but without raised voices over the placement of knitting manuals. If you have ever yawned while rearranging a shelf at home and been unsure whether a certain book is fiction or reference, you have reenacted lightly their work. The physical gestures of this world are especially drowsy. Someone wheels a small trolley between rows, sliding books out, straightening their neighbors, touching each spine in passing. A label slightly torn is peeled off and replaced. A code written in fading ink is traced more clearly. Pencil notes in the old card catalog are erased and rewritten. None of this is urgent, except in the slow cumulative sense that without it, one day nothing will be where it claims to be. But any given action is tiny, almost weightless. Move this volume 3 spaces left. Add a dot between those digits. Adjust the guide card so it protrudes just enough. It is tidying as a philosophy dot in reading rooms. The system reveals its deepest trick. The user thinks in questions about volcanoes, about forgotten queens, about how people slept before mattresses. The librarian thinks in numbers. You'll want something in the 551s, they murmur, or try the DAs along that wall. The visitor follows, fingers brushing rows, until the numbers on the spines match the numbers on the slip. There is a small click of satisfaction as the right book slides free. Behind that moment lies an entire unseen architecture of decisions and renumberings, of long mornings spent checking that 914.2 does in fact come before 914.21, and that nobody has cleverly hidden a detective novel among that laces. Yet the experience is simple. Wander, match, lift, sit dot when digital catalogs arrived. It might have seemed that the spell of printed shelf marks would break. After all, you can type bees or Byzantium and let software rummage for you. But even digital results end, very often, with a call number. The screen hands you letters and digits. You still have to step into the stacks, past the quiet hum of ventilation, and translate that little code into motion. In some libraries, maps display which ranges hold which numerical bands, a cartography of thought. In others, you learn by drifting. Math on this floor, art on that, linguistics in the slightly dim corner behind the lips. The call numbers are the thread you follow, more dependable than memory, less demanding than directions shouted across a busy street. Occasionally, the system misbehaves in interestingly dull ways. A sequence jumps from 305.5 to 320.1 because a shelf of 306s lives on the next unit and nobody has updated the sign. A book is shelved according to an older version of the scheme, so what should be 944 is mysteriously still labeled F8. Attentive readers report these anomalies with gentle triumph. Staff correct them with gentle resignation. There is no scandal, only the ongoing patient work of coaxing thousands of small rectangles into the most sensible order, knowing that sensible shifts slightly every time someone writes a new book about a topic nobody had thought to classify before, such as the cultural history of left-handed roofers. Somewhere in all this, you may begin to feel the underlying kindness of it. Classification, at its best, is an attempt to make it easier for you to find the thing you didn't know you wanted yet. The people who fuss over shelf marks and codes are not restricting you. They are leaving breadcrumbs. They are saying, if you liked that book about medieval bridges, you might like this other one 3 numbers along, quietly waiting with more pictures of arches. The logic is imperfect, riddled with biases and revisions, but the intention is steady. It is like someone staying up late in a quiet building, rearranging tiny symbols so that strangers arriving tomorrow afternoon can feel, for a moment, that the universe of information has edges they can see. As you picture these rows now, perhaps your mind drifts to a long, high room, lit softly, shelves rising on either side. Each spine has its little tag. You walk slowly without needing to read every title. The numbers roll upward and downward around you in a calm sequence. Here a faded volume, there a new glossy one, both tucked into the same numerical family. Somewhere far away, another library uses a slightly different code for the same subjects, but that does not trouble you. Locally, everything fits. A trolley murmurs on its wheels as someone returns books to their homes, sliding each into the gap reserved for that exact combination of digits and dots dotting a corner. The old card catalog still rests, drawers closed, its small brass handles catching almost no light. Inside are cards typed and retyped, shelf marks in careful ink, witnesses to earlier arrangements. No one needs them now, but no one seems quite able to let them go. They are another layer of memory, like the older boundary stones beneath newer posts. When the building grows quiet for the night, the systems stay in place. Numbers on spines neither glow nor fade. They just are. The air cools. The last footsteps recede. Tens of thousands of tiny coordinates hold. Tens of thousands of pages exactly where they promise to be. You do not have to hold any of this in your head. That is the point. Other people, long ago and recently, have worried about the positions, so you do not have to. You can let your thoughts shuffle a little through the imaginary stacks, pausing wherever it feels comfortable, then set down that imaginary book and wander out again. The codes will remain patient and unoffended until someone else arrives. For now, they can keep watch in the dark. Small quiet guardians of order while your own mind, released from cataloging for the day, turns slowly away from letters and numbers and settles, like a book closed gently after the last line, into stillness.